Hi, my name is Robin Swanick and I'm with AARP Nebraska. For the month of September, we're taking a visit to the Hastings Museum located in Hastings, Nebraska to do a 5-part series about the museum. Last week, we showed you an episode on the history of the Hastings Museum, and today we're going to be talking about the animal dioramas. They're located in the museum. Now, if you're viewing this live on Facebook, you can find us here every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time for these segments. After each of these events, though, we can still be found on Facebook as a recorded segment. And when you do find us, please make sure you like us and follow us on our AARP Nebraska page on Facebook. So again, today we're going to do part 2, which is the animal dioramas and the Art of Taxidermy, which is an exhibit that can be found at the Hastings Museum. Our speaker is Teresa Kreitzer-Haldson, who is the Curator of Collections at the Hastings Museum. Teresa, thanks for coming back and talking to us today.
Sure, no problem. I appreciate being able to share our story, so thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about stuffed animals, and I'm assuming there at the Hastings Museum you have several.
We have a few, yes.
Great.
Birds, but you know, we have plenty.
Love it. Well, let's get started. What could you tell us?
Well, first of all, they're mounted animals and not stuffed. Stuffed animals are teddy bears. So that is one thing that a lot of people actually say, and we try and educate them that there is a little bit of a difference. And I am going to talk a little bit about how animals are mounted, both historically and present day. So you kind of get that background. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about our dioramas, but also kind of the history of how dioramas in general came to be.
Love it. That sounds great and exciting and new information, which I'm still learning. So let's hear it.
All right, great. So we'll go to a PowerPoint here so you can see some of the images that we have. And again, I just want to say thank you to AARP for choosing the Hastings Museum. I do appreciate doing this show. And like Robin said last week, I talked about the founding in the museum. And so now I'm going to talk about one of Albert's big goals and how the museum looked and how he wanted the building to appear to visitors. And he wanted to do it right. So he did a lot of consulting. We kind of talked about that last week. And part of what he really wanted to do was have really well done dioramas. So let's delve into this more. And we're going to talk about the art of taxidermy. Next slide, please. So taxidermy originally is not what we would think of today. It was something that was done to entertain more than to educate. And so people made animals look like they were doing human things. We call this anthropomorphic amusement. So you'll see in this picture, there's animals that are playing like they're in an orchestra and they have an audience that's watching them. Like I said, these were popular at one time before we really started seeing the educational value, and they were very popular in the Victorian era, particular in Europe. And people would even have some of these animals set up in their hallways or in their living areas in little domed cases because they just thought that was kind of the cool thing to do, I guess. Next slide, please. But people started seeing the educational value of having animal mounts that were done very well and done in poses that were more lifelike. Many people who did this were actually seeing it as a way to help conserve species. As you see here, this one is of bison. Bison at this time were pretty much decimated in the United States. Their numbers were down to about 500 from about 3 million. And so there were people who decided that they needed to take action. And yes, by killing some animals, they were trying to educate people who maybe wouldn't have seen these animals, particularly on the East Coast. And so they would set up these little displays with these animals to show what the species look like and to build an appreciation and hopefully, you know, save them. The settings were very simplistic. They didn't have a lot of what we would think of for habitat, but as you can see in this picture, there is like some grass and rocks and stuff around them. One of the things that dioramas then, as they do now, don't always necessarily tell you is the amount of space that animals require. And here, I mean, these animals are very close together and bunched up, and you see that in a lot of other dioramas, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So the first task is, of course, trying to mount your animals in a realistic pose. There weren't any books, there wasn't any classes or schools that taught the people at that time how to do this. And so somebody just had to start and kind of figure out how to do it. And they were learning by trial and error. The concept was to start off with a sturdy base. Sometimes that included the bones of the animal. More than likely, it included more metal armatures and wood. And as you can see in these pictures, this is the process of mounting a deer. These were actually pictures taken by Albert Rooking, who was the founder of the museum, and this was his process. This wasn't by any means the only process out there, because he kind of developed this on his own. Other people kind of did it similarly, you can see the armature in the first picture on the left, kind of the framework for it. Then he goes on top of that with sisal, cotton, and other rope and stuff to kind of hold it together to give that body a shape. And then finally, the skin is pulled around it to create the mount. Next slide, please. And while those were certainly better mounts than the anthropomorphic poses, they didn't give the full muscle tone and body characteristics of animals. And so other artists started kind of taking over and creating sculptures, really, of animals that gave that muscle detail. And you can see that in this mannequin here is what we call those, with all the muscle outlines and everything there for the hide to actually form to. You could get the subtle contours of that body. The key thing here is when you were doing these types of things, you really had to study the animal before the skin was taken off. You had to get good measurements because, like humans, not every animal is the same size and shape. And so to really make that skin look good on the mannequin and to make the animal look realistic, they needed to have those good measurements in order to make them look very well done. Next slide, please. As people were trying to learn the process, sometimes they didn't quite get it right. These are two bears that are in our collection, and you might think they look a little odd, and they really are kind of odd. They both look like their necks are a little bit longer than they need to be. Their faces are a little bit misshapen, and this is all part of the process of trying to come up with that ideal mannequin to mount these animals on. So you might see older taxidermy pieces that look similar to this, where they're just kind of funny looking. And just a side note, that poor little polar bear there on the right, he is actually, these are both, like I said, at the Hastings Museum. He is actually on a list for the worst taxidermy. So unfortunately, we have a small claim to fame, but we embrace it and say, yep, that's what taxidermy used to be like. Next slide, please. And faces really are the hardest thing. Again, these are all mounts that are in our collection, and it's hard to get that soft shape of a face into a form that looks realistic, especially if you're using sisal and wood to create that. Now, some taxidermists, they would use the skull, but there's still the soft pieces. For example, the elk in the middle there with his tongue. You can't save a tongue. It's just not possible to really make it look decent. So a lot of times they'd have to form these things out of clay. And the poor little fox's nose is a little too narrow. The other thing is, over time, that little bear on the right, his nose is starting to flake. So these are some of the challenges that taxidermy had to overcome over the years. Next slide, please. Now, today we have much different mannequins. We have plastic inserts or accessories that can help make a mannequin look good. You will see the mouth set that's on the left upper side. This is a fairly realistic recreation of a mouth, and there's different animals. You would have to order these, but you can get bear, you can get deer, you can get raccoon. There's companies that make these that make them look more realistic. There's also these nose pieces that you can put into the skin and form the skin around it, and then paint the nose to be more realistic. You'll see on the right, you'll see what we have now. These are usually a foam mannequin that can be carved to the shape of the animal. So that gives you your custom fit for your skin for animals today. And then you can pose some of the legs. There's a lot of different mounts now that you can change the pose or do a little bit of tweaking. Good taxidermists might even, break a leg or something off of the mannequin to move it around and make it into the pose that they want. So taxidermy, the process has become a lot easier because of the products that people can buy now. And as you can see, that is me standing with one of our Alaskan brown bears. He does have the plastic mouth insert in the nose, and he looks much more realistic and lifelike. Next slide, please. So now that we've got our animals mounted and we need to talk more about their habitat, because that's what gives a lot more information about where these animals live. Good animals need to have that context. And so this is becoming an educational tool now. I'm going to start with a short video that was created by the American Museum of Natural History. This video gives a brief overview of Carl Akeley, who was considered the father of dioramas, and his role in that museum. And it's just a good history that can give you a quick overview without me trying to say it better. Please start. Thank you.
Carl Akeley, who is associated with this museum, is credited with creating the very first habitat diorama in 1889 at the Milwaukee Public Museum, which is still on display there. By 1909, he takes on a job here at the American Museum. Really, the diorama traditions and the methods and protocol for collecting them was already firmly established here at the American Museum by our first ornithologist, Frank Chapman. Frank Chapman is credited with really designing the very first alcove case, which we still use today, with the frame-like window, the proscenium that you look through onto the curved background painting. And really, it was Carl Akeley who embraced Frank Chapman's approach of actually recreating a real place in nature. Chapman insisted that his artists, his taxidermists, would travel with him to the location and actually do a plein air painting and record the actual site, collect all of the plants and accessories at that location. So really the history of dioramas as an educational tool really are entwined with the whole history of the American Museum of Natural History. They first appear as museum exhibits in the late 1800s, and of course this predates modern photography, certainly predates color photography, and of course it predates television and computer technology. So these exhibits, when they first appear, were very powerful tools for science education and environmental nurturing, environmental awareness. Chapman actually used these exhibits as tools to campaign for protection. Some of his sites, like Pelican Island on the coast of Florida, he recreated that diorama to draw attention to the plight of birds like egrets and brown pelicans who were being slaughtered at that time. He appealed to Theodore Roosevelt by showing him this diorama, and Roosevelt responded by designating Pelican Island as the very first wild bird preserve. And of course, when you look at Carl Akeley and his creation of the gorilla diorama and his campaign as a result of working on that exhibit and gathering the data for that exhibit, campaigning for the preservation of the gorilla, they have an international impact on wildlife conservation as well.
Okay, and I encourage you, that was for the American Museum of Natural History. They actually have a great YouTube site on other diorama issues as well as other things in the museum that are very well done. So if you're really interested, I would encourage you to go check out their YouTube site to learn more. So the American Museum of Natural History started sharing their techniques. Chicago was probably one of the first larger institutions that started using some of these ideas that they had for developing dioramas. Of course, Lincoln here in Nebraska, as well as Denver, they were also following suit, but it took time for these things to develop. So in the meantime, some people were trying to create ideas of habitat that were more flat. So we have two examples here of animal mounts that were posed in front of flat paintings for a setting and then photographed. Sometimes these pieces were made with translucent materials so that they could put a light behind them. And this is some of the stuff that Albert used originally and purchased some of them from the Denver Natural History Museum to set some of the animals in front of. Next slide, please. So this is an image of the museum as it stood in one of the school buildings, and you can see that he was trying to create a setting with the bears in the background there. And of course we have our lovely little polar bear again with his nose sticking out there. Originally his display setting was just the base that made it look like snow. Bricking displayed these animals, but he dreamed of something better, some other way of doing this work. And he partnered with other museums to learn their techniques, and he got ideas from the American Museum and from Chicago and from Denver. And he formulated these ideas, so when he got the funding for the WPA project to build the new building, he had an idea of what he wanted to do and how he wanted it to look like. And if you're curious, we still have all of these animals in our museum, and most of them are on display. So we've retained that history for quite a long time. Next slide, please. So in his plans for the new exhibits in the building was to create really realistic dioramas. The Wirch Project Administration money came through in 1937, and almost immediately he set up shop to start building all of the accessories that go into these dioramas. It gave him new opportunities. There were artists that he could hire to do this, and it was all because he wanted to become one of those elite museums. Next slide. So along with the animal mounts and everything, the accessories that they created were all of these foliage pieces. Many of these pieces are made out of plastic and then painted. They were each done individually. There's no machine that would process a whole branch for you of leaves. And so they would take molds of different sizes and shapes of leaves for each plant that they were trying to recreate. And then they would mold each piece and then hand paint them and create the detail, cut the edges and stuff like that. It was a long, tedious process. He had about 9 to 10 people at any one time working on these things, including some holidays, and they made well over 1 million pieces. Now, some of the stuff that you see in the dioramas is natural and they would preserve it. So some of the grasses are natural grasses that they would dry and then spray paint to bring the color back. The branches and the tree trunks and stuff like that, most of those are pieces that they went out and collected and then preserved to put into the diorama. But the leaves of the trees in particular, and even like these cactuses, these were all hand created by the workers that were funded with the WPA project. Next slide, please. So one of those workers is Gertrude Short. She's pictured here on the left. This picture was taken much later, but we really don't have a lot of pictures of this lady. She was in charge of supervising the people who were making the leaves and working on that project. After the museum opened in 1939, she stayed on and she continued to work on exhibit projects. And Albert actually insisted that a lot of these people learn taxidermy. So Gertrude is seen here actually helping the second director, Wilmer Eichste, with a bird mount. But Gertrude stayed on for quite a few years. And like I said, she helped with a lot of the exhibits. So she was one of the first foliage artists, I guess. Next slide, please. At the same time, Don Carr was hired, and he was the first real staff artist in the traditional sense of painting and drawing. His background was actually, sign painting. So he had some skills in painting when he was hired on. He was hired on to oversee the entire WPA exhibit project, including the installation and exhibits. In the process, Brookings sent him to Denver to learn about how to make dioramas. And Denver wasn't that much far ahead of us in their creations of dioramas as we see them today. They started their techniques in the mid-1930s when Alfred Bailey came to the museum from the Field Museum, and he envisioned their dioramas on those curved backgrounds like we have today here, both in Denver and Hastings. Then he would enhance these backgrounds with the foliage that we would see, and that included flowers and plants. And this method was used elsewhere, so they were just kind of trying to catch up at that time. So in a way, they were kind of learning right along with us, but they were training Don on how to do that work as well. Don stayed on staff for about 5 years, and then unfortunately we had a better paying job come along, and we lost him to the Naval Ammunition Depot. Don is actually credited before he left, though, in his 5 years of creating 6 of the dioramas that we still have today. 2 of them are the very large ones. We have the prairie diorama with the bison, as well as the mountain scene that has the bighorn sheep, mountain goats, elk, and the moose. Please go forward 2 slides. Sorry about this. I kind of screwed up when I did my organization, so we'll catch back up in a little bit here. The next artist that we had was Virgil Wells. When Don left for the Naval Ammunition Depot, Albert went to Denver and contracted with Virgil, who had actually worked at the Denver Natural History Museum and was a trained artist. He came here for a year, or was supposed to be here for a year, but Albert, for whatever reason, really didn't like Virgil. He didn't like his work very well and ended the contract early, so he didn't quite make it the whole year. He's only credited with 3 of our dioramas, and that is the polar bear and polar scene with the muskox, the deer, and the stone sheep. Go back 1 slide, please. So when Albert let him go, he went to Hastings College and asked the art director there who there might be that could do this work. And the art program wasn't really a full-fledged program yet at Hastings College, but there was somebody who was teaching students some art, and the instructor said, well, I have the perfect girl for you. And so she introduced Iris Doherty to Albert. And in Iris's own words, she said Albert was very convincing about this job because she really didn't feel very confident in her work. She was really just kind of starting out, hadn't really done it professionally at all. And he told her, if you can do an 8x10, you can do a diorama. And if you can do it in black and white or pencil, you can do it in color. So she went ahead and joined the staff and started painting dioramas. According to her, many of these places she had never seen, and her first project was the marsh scene and the Platte River scene with the birds. And she said she wasn't very confident in doing this work because she had never actually been to the Platte River at that time. And you've got to remember that this was just coming out of the Depression, so they probably didn't travel a lot. And so she had to do it with pictures, and we still think that she has done some of the best work here in the museum. She was our longest artist, who did 11 dioramas in the museum, including most of the bird dioramas as well as some of the mammals. She went on from the Hastings Museum to go to art school in New York and came back to Nebraska later and worked not only for the Hastings Museum, but also for Morrill Hall in Lincoln, painting dioramas there as well. After she married, she traveled around the country as well as the world, and everywhere she went, she was instrumental in some kind of a museum project. In Anchorage, Alaska, she was one of the lead staff people at that museum, helping found a lot of the Anchorage, Alaska exhibits that they had at that time. She also helped with museums in Australia. And so she was very keen to that history and wanting to help display the heritage and the history of wherever she lived. Interestingly enough, she chose to retire back to Hastings. She lived here for probably about 20 years after retiring, but she didn't really retire. She started her own store, and that's a whole nother story. But unfortunately, we lost Iris just a couple years ago, and but we still really appreciate her and all the work that she did here. Next slide, please, or 2 slides, please. So the last true taxidermist and artist on staff was Burton Nelson. He was a longstanding employee here at the museum, starting out as a volunteer in high school and then becoming a staff person. One of the interesting things that happened while he was on staff here is there was funding that came through. So when he was stationed in the Army in Alaska, he and Wilmer Eichste went on an expedition and hunted really the only mammals for the museum that were specifically hunted by museum staff. They hunted the seals with permission, of course, up there in Alaska. The animals were brought back here to Hastings, and then when Burton got out of the military, he was instrumental in creating the taxidermy mounts, as well as helping with the diorama itself. At that time, Iris was also still here, so I'm sure she taught him some techniques along the way as they did the seal dioramas. He ended up doing 3 other dioramas in the building, and one of them was actually quite innovative at that time and still is looked at as a very quality piece, and that was the otter case that we have. He created, with a lot of research, realistic water for those dioramas. So he was our last artist, and I actually am his replacement. So I've been here for about 20 years. Unfortunately, I can't claim any taxidermy or artwork in the scale of my predecessors. Next slide, please. We do consider here at the Hastings Museum that the dioramas are a piece of our history. We have no desire to remove them. We have considered replacing some of the animal mounts. Some of the animal mounts are quite old. Some of them have been faded quite a lot from the lighting, and some of them are just not nice pieces. Unfortunately, it takes quite a bit of money to replace these animals, plus you have to have them posed in a position that would not make it so that we'd have to change the dioramas. We do our cleaning in these dioramas, and as you will see, if you remember from our last episode, I was telling you that they repurposed a lot of material from the Morton School building when they built this building, and you can see some of the repurposed wood, and you can even see what was probably one of the WPA signs that's left on the inside of these dioramas. Visitors can't see these because it's on the back of the glass part, but it's kind of fun to know that that stuff is still there. Next slide, please. In my time here, like I said, we haven't really done anything to dioramas. We haven't added anything. We did do a little bit of work a few years ago. We had a display room that had large animal mounts that would fit in other places, and we wanted to move them into these habitat settings to give them more context. And one of them was this large polar bear. So we changed that diorama, and we didn't change the painting part. We just tore out some of the foreground in order to make room for the additional bear, and then redesigned it a little bit to give a seal hole, because that particular bear was posed with the seal, to give it some context. Again, we didn't change any of the background, just the foreground where the polar bears were, and then that's also in with the muskox. So we had to kind of blend and mix to make that kind of all look like it went together and was done at one time. Lucky for us, there were no plants to create, so we only had to figure out how to make snow and fake water. Next slide, please. So people today still enjoy our dioramas, and schools use them to teach about habitats to their students, which is a big part of the state standards and curriculum for school groups. So they're still a very valuable tool for the purpose that they were intended way back in the early 1900s. We do often get questions about our dioramas. One of the most often asked questions is, did we kill all of the animals? And where did the babies come from? So the answer is, the museum staff did not kill most of these animals. A lot of them were donated, or they were traded with other museums to get the pelts for them. Like I said a little bit ago, the seals were really the only mammals that were hunted for the purpose of the exhibits in the museum. Now, Albert Burking did do a lot of hunting on his own, and most of the birds have been hunted by previous staff. But as far as the mammals and stuff, they have not. As far as the babies are concerned, some of them come because of natural death. Some of them have had accidents, and the bodies were reclaimed for the purpose of putting into these dioramas. So I could go on and on about each one of them, but that's a whole nother story. And if you ever have questions, feel free to email or call me, and I can talk to you about them. Next slide, please. So if you want to take a look at the artwork, or even see some of the taxidermy mounts and see what we've been talking about today, please plan to visit the Hastings Museum. We do have changed hours because of our COVID policies, so please call ahead just to be sure that we're open, but these are our current hours, and we would appreciate you coming and taking a look. Next slide, please. And we do have some other events coming up. Like I said, please make sure that you check with our website or call in, and we can give you the most current times on our films and our planetarium shows. And then we also, just as a reminder, have our digital scavenger hunt scheduled for this Friday from 6:30 to 9, and there's more details on our website about that as well. Next slide, please. And I said it last week, but I just wanted to remind everybody that the Hastings Museum is a department of the City of Hastings, and we do thank the city for all of their help. So thanks again for coming out and listening to us today. I appreciate your time, and hope to see you back next week.
Teresa, this was great information. I have a couple questions, so if you would entertain us with that, I would really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so your museum is 3 stories. Could you tell me which story or how many different stories you have the animals located?
So we have animal dioramas. We call it our habitat hall or diorama hall on the main level. And that has all of the mammals that we have and most of what I was showing you for pictures. And then on our second floor, our top floor, is our bird dioramas. And they take up just part of the top floor.
Perfect. All
In
right.
total, we have 23 dioramas. So.
23. Okay.
Yep.
How old is your oldest animal there, and what is the animal?
Our oldest animal that I'm aware of is a bison that is in the diorama, prairie diorama, and he's About 130 some years now. He was mounted by Louis Dyke, and this is the same taxidermist who is credited for mounting George Custer's horse, which is down at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. So, yeah.
Very good.
Albert traded for him at some point, and as far as I know, he's our oldest mount.
And when was the last mount that you received? What year do you think? What time period?
Well, actually, we have had some bird mounts that have come in my time period. I don't remember if I talked about it a little bit last week, but we can get animals through salvage. And so if somebody finds an animal that has died, particularly birds, they can call us and we can come out and salvage it and have it mounted for taxidermy. And we've had a couple that have been donated with the taxidermy fees paid for by the person who found the animal. So I think our last one was a snowy owl, and it was probably about 2009, maybe.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So in the film, or you were showing us pictures where like the nose and the tongue are actually not real, but these are created fabric. You didn't say anything about the eyes. Tell me about the eyes of the.
Oh, yes. The eyes, and the eyes have been glass for a very long time. The quality of the eyes has changed from the very early taxidermy, but yes, all of the eyes are glass. And there are different kinds of eyes. Like not every animal has the same type of eye shape, not the same kind of iris. And so you do have to order the right kind of eye. So if you have a fish, you have a fish eye. If you have a hooved animal, you know, their eyes are different. So yeah.
Wow.
They're made of glass.
Okay, so here's the last question that I have.
Sure.
And that is, as the curator of the museum, when it comes to cleaning the dioramas, what do you feel is the worst part of the job?
Well, for me personally, the worst part is just being around the animals. For some reason, that really creeps me out. But and here I am in a natural history museum. But one of the things, I find it more amusing, but a lot of people think it's the worst part, is cleaning the eyes. And now, like I said, they are glass, but in order to clean those, you have to clean them with a Q-tip, and the best cleaning solution is saliva. So we take the Q-tip, we put it in our mouth and get it wet, and we wipe the eye off, and then we don't lick the Q-tip again. We throw it away and get a different one. But
wow. And
yeah.
why is that? Why the enzymes of your mouth? Is that better than Lysol or Pine Sol?
It's just something, it's more of a mild cleanser, I guess. And if you think about it, you know, our mouths help break down food, you know, saliva and everything. So, yeah, I don't know how they decided that that was the best cleaning solution, but there's a lot of things that we literally do spit shine.
I know. Princess, we learned an amazing amount today. I want to thank you for opening our eyes, giving us the education, and now I'll remember to say that these are not stuffed animals. And the video really brought that to life to help me to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel bad about it because a lot of people call them stuffed animals, and you know,
it's really the pelt over a Fabergé type of structure. So I love the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so for our viewers, we still have you for 3 more episodes.
Yes.
Next week, Wednesday at 11 a.m., we're going to do the hidden gems that can be found in the Hastings Museum. And Teresa, you'll be right back here telling us all about that?
Yes, absolutely. We have some things that people don't realize the history of. So,
well, I am so excited to learn about that and hear more about what's inside the Hastings Museum. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next.
bye-bye.